what if we put as the heart of our marriage, not this idea of like, hey, it's two of us, we're each putting in 50-50, right? You walk the dog, I'll put the kids to bed. You do the dishes, I'll do the laundry. That it's a give and get. It's a give and get. It's this contractual relationship. What if instead we just put 100% in? And we said that, hey, you know what? I will be the spouse that I ought to be, regardless of if you are the spouse that you ought to be. Because the reason I am in this marriage is not for what I can get out of it. It's not for what I can gain, but the purpose of this household is gospel reenactment. And so I'm going to set as the standard of my love, not the love I see in Hallmark movies or Disney princess flicks, but I'm going to set as the standard of my love, the standard of Christ. That I'm going to lay my life down to be the best spouse that I can be, regardless of if you are the best spouse that you ought to be. Now, hear me out in this. Here's the thing about my mom. Maybe you have someone in your life. It kind of it just makes you think of them. But my mom is the most sentimental person I have ever met in my life. Okay. My mom is the kind of person who every gift that she gives is never just a gift. It is always some kind of symbol. It's some kind of analogy. My mom gives you a coat. It's not just a coat, everybody. If my mom gives you a coat, it is a symbol of God covering you as you go about your life. If my mom gives you a lamp, it's not just a piece of home decor. That lamp is God's light shining upon your path. If my mom was to buy you a coffee in the cafe over there, it is not just a coffee. It is God's life unto your bones. And so that's a little bit of how my mom is. And so a couple of days before the wedding, my mom shows up at Laura's front door. And she knocks on the door, and Laura opens it, and my mom is holding this plant, okay? But immediately, Laura knows that, of course, because this is my mom, this plant is not just a plant. And so my mom goes on to explain how the day that her darling son was born, her favorite of all her children, as I like to say, the day that her son was born, she had this close friend in her life who gave her this little sapling, this little baby plant. And she starts drawing this analogy of how she's watched me grow up from, baby to child to teenager to adult to now this young man standing before her, that she's watched as this plant has grown with me. And she starts sharing with Laura all this touchy-feely stuff of how in the same way that she's watched my life blossom and she's watched my life bloom, that she's watched this plant bloom along the way. And so what she was giving that day to Laura was a plant, but how many of you know it was not just a plant, okay? What my mom was giving Laura that day was, in essence, she was giving Laura an extension of her son. She was giving Laura a piece of her son, and I know it's sweet. I know it's kind of cute. I know this is the part where you go like, oh, it's a really sweet mom thing to do. All the moms are taking notes. I'm going to get a plant for my son right now. And it is sweet. It is nice. That is until you understand Laura's history of botanical care, okay? Which is more so less a history of care, and it's more a history of death. It is a history of overwatering. It is a history of underwatering. It's a history of drooping leaves, of thirsty flowers, of dried up succulents. At one point in our relationship, she managed to kill a cactus. The desert can't kill a cactus, but my wife has managed to kill a cactus. And so as my mom places this plant into the hands of my soon-to-be wife, little does she know that in the back of Laura's mind, she is taking on this burden of figuratively keeping my mom's son alive. She's got in the back of her head, she's like, if I kill this plant, I essentially am killing Ben. And good news is 6.5 years in, and the Ben plant, as we like to call it, the Ben plant is still going strong, all right? So Laura's really turned it around in the botanical care. But if I ever no-show on a Sunday morning, the first thing I need you to check are the house plants, okay? I'm worried that when that thing goes, I might go with it. But so far, so good. Had a couple close calls, but we made it. But I bring this up to you today because I think that while the Ben plant is somewhat of a heavy responsibility for my wife, while the Ben plant is kind of like this metaphor, this analogy for my mom and her, I think it actually serves as a somewhat effective picture of relationships, okay? Now, hear me out in this. If Laura was to decide one day that, you know what, I've been taking care of this plant for 6.5 years. I've given it a lot of water. I've made sure it's gotten a lot of sun. I've been taking care of this plant for 6.5 years. I'm going to take my hands off the wheel. I think I've put my dues in. I've put my work in. How many of you know that it might take a little while? It might take a week. It might take a couple weeks. It might take a couple months. But eventually what's going to happen is that plant is going to wither and that plant is going to die. And I think that the same is true for our relationships. Is that like a plant, like a garden, I think that we have to be attentive to the care of our relationships. There's sometimes this temptation to kind of set it and forget it. The next thing we know is that our relationship has grown into a thing that we didn't plan for it to be. Check this out. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul actually paints for us this picture of a garden. And he says in verse 6, he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Now, to give you a little bit of context, what Paul is actually talking about here is the church, right? And what he's saying is that, yes, God has a part in the growth of the church. God has a part in making things develop, of causing it to bloom. But he's saying, but I still had to water and we still had to plant. That there was still some work, there was still some effort on our parts, and then God brought the increase. Now, what does that have to do with marriage? See, it's actually not that crazy to draw a comparison between what Paul is saying, this picture he's painting of the church, and the picture that we paint of marriage. In fact, a lot of comparisons can be drawn between the church and a marriage. It says this in 1 Timothy 3:15. He says that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave, check this out, in the household of God, which is the church. The household of God, which is the church. The church is the household of God. The church is the bride of Christ. And in a similar sense, the family unit, therefore, actually functions kind of like a mini church. And so this picture that Paul is painting, these analogies that we see through Scripture of the church and a garden can actually be attributed to our relationships. They can actually be attributed to our marriages. They can actually be attributed to our families. And now if I were to neglect my garden, not that I have a garden, but hypothetically, if I did have a garden, if I was to neglect my garden, I never cared for it, I never tended it, could I really blame the seed if it bears no fruit? Like if I just go out this spring, I take a whole bunch of seeds and I just throw them across my backyard. And I just trust that, hey, they're just going to grow. They're just going to do their thing. Can I really blame the seeds if I haven't put in the time, if I haven't put in the work, if I haven't put in energy? Can I blame the seeds when they bear no fruit? See, what does a garden require? A garden requires work. A garden requires time. A garden requires patience, energy. It takes effort to see good things grow. And yet, in a similar sense, how often in marriage do we scatter the seed and then neglect it? And then we blame all the problems we have in the relationship on the person that we're married to. I believe that any seed under the right care can bear much fruit. That's not about the seed that you choose, but it's the care that you give the seed. It's the attention that you give the seed. It's the environment you put the seed in that leads the seed to bear fruit. And I think in a similar sense that any person, the person that you are engaged to marry, the person that you did marry, the person you've been married to for 20, 30 years, or the person that you are hoping to marry, I believe that any person has the potential to have a healthy, fruitful relationship. Any person has the capacity to have a healthy, fruitful relationship, but like a seed, every person needs the right environment, the right care in order for that relationship to flourish. And you can have the best seed, the cream of the crop, but if you neglect them, that seed's going to wither and die. The same is true with our relationships. And so what does every plant need in order to thrive? That if we want to see our love bloom, if we want to set ourselves up for stability in our relationships, if we want to see it grow into all that God has called it to be, what does it need? What does every plant need? I have 3 things I want to go through with you today. 3 things that I believe every garden needs, every plant needs, even that Ben plant needs. 3 things every plant needs to grow are to be planted, to be watered, and to be pruned. To be planted, watered, and pruned. These are the 3 things that I want to go through with us today. And starting with point number 1, we have to be planted. If we want to see our relationships bear fruit, if we want to see them grow into something healthy, then we have to be planted. And what does it mean to be planted? It means you've got your roots in something. right? I think about it like in the springtime, one of my favorite things is when a thunderstorm blows through. I love thunderstorms. I think they're awesome, but I'm also kind of scared of them, okay? It's like that dichotomy of like, this is really cool, but I'm the man of the house, so I have to act really brave right now because it's a little bit scary, right? And I live in an older house. My home was built in, I think, like the 80s or something like that. And so when a really big storm blows through our neighborhood, my whole house starts to shake. My whole house starts to rattle. My windows are making noises. My doors are creaking. And there's this moment sometimes where you're like, is my whole house just going to blow away right now? And then the storm eventually dies down. The wind cools off. The rain stops falling. And you step into your backyard. And every single time I have this anticipation in my mind where I'm going to step outside and things are going to be in total disarray, right? And sometimes you might find like there's some ornaments blown over or the barbecue cover came off or maybe like the garbage bin tipped over and spilled some rubbish everywhere. But not once have I gone outside and have found my bushes uprooted. Not once have I gone outside after a storm and seen my trees knocked over. Why? Because they're rooted to something. You know, you even take something as intense as like a hurricane. Not that I've ever been in a hurricane, but you see those videos that people film as like the winds are coming in off of the ocean. And you see those videos of the palm trees and they're bent at a nearly horizontal angle and the wind is beating against them and it's blowing against them. And you're just waiting and waiting and waiting. And yet those trees don't blow away. They don't get caught up in the gale of the storm, that they hold their ground. Why? Because they're rooted to something. They have their roots in something. And I think that in the context of relationships, conflict is inevitable. I think that conflict is not a question of if. Conflict is a question of when. And that like that storm blowing through my neighborhood, like those hurricane winds blowing against those trees, I think that there's seasons in relationships when the wind really starts picking up. There's seasons in relationships when the rain starts blowing and you start forgetting what the sunshine was like. I think there's seasons in relationships where it can be points of conflict. It can be points of tension. It can be points of difficulty. And when the storm comes, church, I believe that what causes one tree to fall and another tree to hold its ground is not the force of the breeze. It's the depth of the roots. You can have a tree, a beautiful oak tree, but if that tree has no roots, a gentle breeze could knock it over. But you see these trees, you see these plants stand strong within the most powerful breeze. Why? Because of the depth of their roots. If we want our relationships, if we want our marriages, if we want our love to last the tides of time, we have to be rooted to something. We have to be grounded in something. And I think it's always hardest to remember the sunshine when you're in the middle of the storm. It's hardest to remember what the sun feels like when it's the middle of winter. And I think that when life throws its worst at us, it can be challenging in that season to remember, why am I in this? Why did I sign up for this? When the little things that they're doing are getting under your skin, it's just like they're just breathing the wrong way right now. Can you just sleep quieter, please, right? When the little things just start getting under our skin or they escalate into even bigger things, that it's in those seasons that we have to remember why. Why? And so the question is then, why? Why do we get married? Why do we fall in love? Or in a broader sense, what is the purpose of marriage? I want to break this down for you a little bit today. What is the purpose of marriage? If we look back at ancient cultures, that for most of human history, the purpose of marriage has been pretty clear. Marriage is not a new thing. Marriage has been around for a long, long time. But for most of those years, the purpose of marriage was about security, stability, and status. That it was not like this fantasized thing where two people fall in love, Romeo meets Juliet, and it's just this whole beautiful love story. But through most of human history, it's actually been this thing of that I'm going to marry for status, right? That we're going to climb the social ladder through who we're marrying, or we're going to build stability, right? That we're going to maintain a household. We're going to do it for the purposes of security, of procreation. That it's just been this very not emotional thing, but a factual arrangement that's made to bring people together. You contrast that with modern marriage, and I think we have this very Disneyfied idea of marriage. We've almost swung to the complete opposite idea of that, right? That boy meets girl, girl meets boy. One thing leads to another. They fall in love, and there's nothing innately wrong with either one of these views of marriage, except that quite honestly, I think they're both actually just a little bit shallow. I think it's a superficial idea of love that roots don't go down deep enough to actually withstand the storms of life. You know, if love was something that we just fall into, like so many of the movies that we watch kind of teach that it is, just this thing that you sort of like trip into and you fall in love. If love is something we fall into, then I think love is something we can just as easily fall out of. If it's something we fall into, then it's something that we can fall out of. I think that our love has to be based on something deeper than that. What is the purpose of marriage? I believe that the purpose of marriage, beyond the Hallmark movies, beyond the rom-coms, beyond all the Disney princess stories of Prince Charming and Cinderella, I believe that the purpose of marriage at its core is simply this. It is gospel reenactment. The purpose of marriage is gospel reenactment. See, we see a picture. What do you see in the picture of the gospel? If you were to sum it up, that essentially what the gospel is that we see mankind stuck in the human condition and Christ coming through sacrificial love to free us from our sin and help us become who we were called to be. Now, where does that fit into the idea of marriage? Check this out. In Ephesians 5:25, it says this: husbands, love your wives, not as you were taught in modern Hollywood movies. Husbands, love your wives, not as the Disney princess movies teach you to do so. But it says, husbands, love your wives as what? As Christ loved the church. Husbands, love your wife. What is the ultimate expression of love? What is the perfect picture of marriage? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Church, could it be that the perfect picture of marriage is actually the picture of the cross? The perfect picture of marriage is actually the picture of the cross. That the purpose of our marriage is to, like Christ, help our spouse become all that God has called them to be through sacrificial love. So I think the challenge of modern marriage is that we kind of approach things through this idea of me, not we. That we're looking at it often through a lens of like, what am I gaining out of this? Right? We have this consumerist idea that kind of permeates our whole culture. I don't know what the exact statistics are, but even if you look at like employment rates of how long people stick with a certain company, that it's like every couple of years, most people are moving jobs. Why? Because they aren't in their job for what they can give to their job. They're in their job for what you can get out of your job, right? And so I'm going to go to where the pay is best, or I'm going to go to where the environment is best, or I'm going to go to where I like it the best. That it's not about what I'm giving, it's about what I'm getting. And that's okay for your employer. But if we use that as the framework, if we build our relationships on the foundation of consumerism, then as soon as the relationship starts profiting our gain, as soon as we stop getting something out of it, then how are we expecting that relationship to last? That if we want our relationships to last the tides of time, then we have to build it on the foundation of something better. That if we see our relationships through the framework, through the reflection of the gospel, then the mindset of our marriage completely and absolutely changes. Because then all of a sudden, we start looking at this relationship as not as, hey, what can my spouse do for me? But we start looking at this relationship of how can I love my spouse so radically that I can help them become everything that God has called them to be. That what if we put as the heart of our marriage, not this idea of like, hey, it's two of us, we're each putting in 50-50, right? You know, you walk the dog, I'll put the kids to bed. You do the dishes, I'll do the laundry. That it's a give and get. It's a give and get. It's this contractual relationship. What if instead we just put 100% in? And we said that, hey, you know what? I will be the spouse that I ought to be, regardless of if you are the spouse that you ought to be. Because the reason I am in this marriage is not for what I can get out of it. It's not for what I can gain, but the purpose of this household is gospel reenactment. And so I'm going to set as the standard of my love, not the love I see in Hallmark movies or Disney princess flicks, but I'm going to set as the standard of my love, the standard of Christ. That I'm going to lay my life down to be the best spouse that I can be, regardless of if you are the best spouse that you ought to be. Now, I want to preface this by saying that if it's like an abusive situation, that's not what I'm talking about. That sometimes in a situation like that, the most loving thing that you can do is bring accountability to your spouse's actions. But I'm talking like, I think that the thing that separates us more often than not, Laura and I like to call them the tippy taps, right? The little like, you know, like your socks are on the counter, you didn't put the dishes away. That it's these little things, these little voices, these little irritations that start getting in the way, that start causing this conflict, that start causing this divide of our love between one another. But could it be, church, that the more we act in love when we don't feel love, the more our love will actually grow? Could it be that the more we act in love when we don't feel love, the more our love will actually grow? So how do we help that love grow? Point number one, we have to be planted. Point number two, we've got to be watered. We've got to be watered. What are you feeding your marriage? If you've ever tended to a garden before, then you probably know that planting a garden is a lot of work, but planting the garden isn't where the work ends. It's actually where the work begins. Like I was talking about before, that if you just took your seeds and you scattered them, can you really expect those seeds to bear much fruit? If you take a seed, even the best seed, and you plant it and you leave it and you neglect it, eventually that seed is going to wither and die. Why? Because a seed needs care. A seed needs to be nourished. A seed needs to be cherished. It needs water. It needs fertilizer. It needs nutrients. And I believe that the same is true for the context of our relationships. Often we look at marriage as like the ultimate goal, that if I can just get married, then everything's going to be okay. But what if marriage is not what we work towards, but marriage is actually where our work begins? It says this in that same verse I was reading before. It goes on to say in verse 28, Ephesians 5, that in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own body. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. Nourishes and cherishes. I want you to pick this up, church. The language that Paul is using in this passage is not passive, it is active. It's not this thing that's like a slow cooker kind of love that you just throw all the ingredients into the pot, you hit start, and you just kind of let it do its thing. You know, you set it and you forget it. You know, I got the ring on the finger, I can just leave it be now. It's an active love, not a passive love. To be nourished and cherished. See, a relationship like a garden needs to be cared for. It needs to be tended to. It's not enough just to plant it and leave it. It needs to be nourished. And so like water unto a seed, what kind of work, what kind of effort, what kind of time do we need to put into a relationship in order for that relationship to bear much fruit? That what is the nutrients? What is the kind of work? What is the kind of effort that's going to cause our love to bloom in full effect? I think it says this in Proverbs 18, verse 20, that from the fruit of a man's mouth, his stomach is satisfied. He is satisfied by what? By the yield of his lips. Your words have the power to set the direction of your relationships. That both death and life are in the power of the tongue. And those who love it will eat its fruit. What bears fruit in your relationship is the way you use your words. I believe that one of the most dangerous things to a healthy relationship is a careless tongue. Not just the relationship with our spouse, relationship with our friends, with our children, our families, our coworkers. A careless tongue can be one of the most damaging things in our lives. And I want you to understand, church, that your words, not someone else's words, your words have the capacity to bless your marriage. They have the capacity to curse your marriage. They have the capacity to turn your relationship into an absolute heaven, and they have the capacity to make it an absolute hell. Your words have the capacity to bring life, and your words have the capacity to bring death. Words matter. Words are important. And so how can we ensure that our words are giving our relationships the nourishment that it actually needs? How can we make sure that our words are leading us in the right direction? See, I think about it kind of like this, that let's say at the end of the service, you just wanted to say you love me. You're just feeling all sappy. Love is in the air. Valentine's Day is coming up. I just want to tell Ben I love him. But you come up to me and you say it in Norwegian. Your words, they may be thoughtful, but they're going to go right over my head. I'm not going to understand a word that you're saying. Why? Because we're speaking different languages. Now, similarly, in the context of relationships, if we want our partner to feel loved, if we want our loved ones to feel loved, I don't think it's sufficient just to speak love. We have to speak love the way that our partner receives love. That it's not just enough to speak love, we have to speak their love language. And so what is a love language? A love language is simply, it's the behaviors, it's the actions, it's the words, it's the vocabulary that makes your loved ones feel loved. Those things that when somebody does it, it just kind of sets butterflies in your tummy. It just makes you feel good. It just makes you feel encouraged. It makes you feel loved. And I think that one of the greatest points of frustration within relationships is when both people are trying their absolute hardest to communicate that they love one another, but they're speaking the wrong language. They're trying to say, I love you, but they're not doing it in the way that their partner receives it. You know, I think about it like this. I have a 1-year-old at home. Her name is Eleanor. She's the bomb. I love her a lot. And she just turned 1 in December, and she is entering full-blown toddlerhood. Everything from sticky fingers to stubby legs and everything in between. I'm loving every second of it. But one of the fun things right now is that Eleanor is discovering language. She's learning all about the different things that she has to say. She's starting to work on different little words and sounds. She's got mama, she's got dada, and she's got tomato. Those are her 3 words right now. Kid loves tomatoes. But it's kind of a funny thing to witness right now because it's fun for us, but it's actually really frustrating for her. Because she's in this unique stage of life where she knows the thing that she wants, right? Maybe you've seen this in your own kids. That she has something she wants to show us. She has something that she wants to point out to us. She has something that she wants to tell us, something that she needs, something that she wants, but she doesn't have the words to communicate it. She's aware of what she needs. She's aware of what she wants. She's aware of what she's trying to show us, but it doesn't land in our ears. Why? Because we don't understand what she is saying. See, here's the thing about communication is that communication is only as effective as it is received. Communication is only as effective as it is understood. And I think that just like Eleanor, that we hit this frustrating impasse in relationships where both spouses are trying their hardest to love each other, but because they're speaking different languages, the message just doesn't quite connect. You know, he's putting in these long overtime hours at work because he has this picture of loving his family, that he's going to take that overtime pay and he's going to take his wife and kids on this Disneyland vacation. And it's going to be incredible and it's going to be awesome, but she's irritated with him every time he shows up late. Because in her head, what she needs to feel loved is not a vacation. She just needs him home tonight. Or alternatively, maybe vice versa, is that he's got these struggles going on at work. He's frustrated about these things, these relationship dynamics. They're getting under his skin. He's frustrated about it, and she's offering all this input of how to help. All this input of how you can fix it, of how you can work through it. And every time she brings it up, he just gets agitated. She's trying to help. She's trying to do it in love, but it's just frustrating him. Why? Because what he needs is actually for her to just say, I'm proud of you. It's not enough to just speak love. We have to speak love in the language our spouse receives love. You know, I've seen this firsthand in my relationship with Laura. Well, I'll do like all the housework. She's out of the house. I'll clean everything, do the dishes, get dinner on the stove, mow the lawn, water the grass. She comes home. Everything is spotless. I'm like, Laura, did you see what I did today? And she'll be like, oh, yeah, that's cool, right? It's kind of like whatever. I'm like, do you not understand how amazing I am? Like, come on. And then alternatively, like just on my way out the door, I'll just leave like a 3-letter note of just like, I love you on a sticky note, stick it on the fridge. And she sees it and she's like, you're the best man in the world. I love you so much. I can't believe how lucky I am, right? And I'm like, sweet, I'm not going to do the dishes anymore, right? Why? I'm trying to communicate love in both ways, but if I want to communicate love effectively, I have to communicate it the way that she's going to receive it. And that might be different than the way I receive it. So the question for you becomes is how do your loved ones receive love? How do your loved ones respond to love? I'm not going to stand up here and give you the answer to that because quite frankly, that's actually your job. That's your job to discover. And I think that's half the fun. I think that we have to approach it as like this continual quest of I'm going to learn, I'm going to take it as my responsibility to discover how my spouse receives love. And I mean, there's a ton of articles and there's blogs and there's all sorts of archetypes and categories that people have made of trying to boil down love languages into X amount of areas or X amount of archetypes. And quite frankly, I think people are just more complicated than that. And not just that, but I think love languages change over time. There might be seasons where you receive love in one way, but seasons change and you change with it. And so it means that as a spouse, as a partner, again, we can't just set it and forget it, but we have to continually tend to that garden. Then in one season of life, she may receive love by just like anytime she's upset, you just give her a hug and that's all she needs. And then she has kids and she goes, please don't touch me. I'm over it, right? How does your partner receive love? If we really care about showing them love, we're going to learn how to communicate love the way that they receive it. So in order to see love bloom in our relationships, we need to, again, number one, we got to be planted. Number two, we've got to be watered. And then number three, finally, we need to be pruned. We need to be pruned. See, if we look at watering a garden as a thing we add to it to give it life, then I think that with the same goal in mind, to prune our garden is what we take away. They're both working towards the same goal. They're both working towards seeing that plant grow, to seeing it flourish, to see that relationship bear much fruit. But to water it is what we add. To prune it is to take away. And I think in my experience, at least, I've definitely found one of those things to be easier than the other. See, I recognize that I am the kind of guy, I've learned this about myself over the years, is I'm the kind of guy who will do anything for a smooth life. I just want peace. I'm a peacemaker. I'm a peacekeeper. I will do anything to avoid conflict. That's not what I'm interested in. I don't seek that kind of stuff out. I'm the kind of guy that I see my check engine light on the car and I just like put a little sticky note over it, right? Can't be bothered. The dishwasher is making a funny noise. It's probably just a spoon stuck in there somewhere. It can't be a real problem, right? The furnace stops working. We could just put on sweaters. We'll be okay, right? Like I am the kind of guy who's going to do anything to just maintain peace. I recognize that that's a little bit of how I am, but how many of you know that ignoring a problem doesn't solve a problem? Ignoring a problem doesn't solve a problem. In fact, more often than not, I think it actually just prolongs the problem. I think that sometimes what a garden needs most is a thing that we'd rather not do. Sometimes what a garden needs most is not just more water, is not just more fertilizer, but it's sometimes pruning away the things that we don't want to cut. Why? Because it's painful. It hurts. It's uncomfortable. I think that's similar to a plant, the same way that sometimes weeds can grow that need to be removed as they're sucking the life out of that plant. I think that there's certain things that can sometimes take root in our relationships. They might seem minor, you know? It's just that little irritation about that thing he always says or the way that she does that. A little frustration, that little irritation. But it's not that big of a deal, so I'll just bottle it. But when you let things fester, they have a tendency to continue to grow. The longer you let them grow, the longer they hinder your relationship itself from growing. So I think if we're really committed to a healthy relationship, then we have to be attentive, not just to the things we are adding to our relationship, but actually the things that we're attacking. And sometimes that means having conversations that we don't want to have. Sometimes that means bringing up issues that we would rather leave unsaid. But it's key. It's a core tenet of a healthy relationship. But here's the thing about pruning is that sometimes if you've ever pruned your garden, it can be a little easy to get carried away, right? You're just locked in on what you're doing and you're like, oh, this is actually kind of fun to chop these branches and do this stuff and all that kind of thing. And the next thing you know, you step back and you're like, oh shoot, I cut down the whole bush, right? I think the same is true with conflict, that sometimes we're very apprehensive to have it. Sometimes we're very slow to bring things up, but then when we do, that thing spirals into this thing, and then this thing spirals into that thing, and then that thing spirals into these things. And the next thing we know is we just chop down the whole bush. See, conflict is this sensitive thing in relationships because conflict can be the thing that either brings us together or it can be the thing that pushes us apart. And so I want to give you, as we wrap up today, just a couple of really basic principles, a couple of questions that we can ask ourselves before we enter conflict so we can do so in a healthy way that brings us together instead of pushes us apart. It's just 3 simple questions to ask ourselves as we're pruning things in our relationship. And the first one is simply, what's the goal? What's the goal? Why am I bringing this up? Am I bringing this up because I'm just kind of mad at you and I just want to like dig it in a little bit? Am I bringing this up because I kind of want to like raise my level of power within the relationship and make you feel kind of bad? Why am I bringing this up? I think we have to remember again our why. Why are we planted in the first place? The goal of our marriage is gospel reenactment. That's to help my spouse bring the best version of themselves out, to help them be all that God has called them to be, right? That's the posture of our heart towards marriage. And so why am I going to bring up a problem? Not because I want to like pour salt in the wound, but I'm going to bring something up because I think by doing so, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help us become a stronger, better version of ourselves. But I'm going to do so with wisdom. It says this in Proverbs 14:15, that the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. The prudent gives thought to his steps. What does that mean? That means I'm not just going to go in, guns blazing, bang, 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 bang. We're going to just tackle every issue at once. No, I'm going to attack the problem without attacking the person. In this conflict, in this relationship, I'm going to go after what the issue is, but I'm not going to go after you. I'm going to have the maturity to actually separate those two things and address the problem without addressing the person. Why? Because my goal is to overcome the issue, not hurt the person I love. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the goal of this conversation? The second one is this: what part have I played? A relationship is a two-way street. There's two people in every relationship. The minute that there's not, it stops being a relationship. And so in every issue within a relationship, there are two people involved. It says this in Matthew 7, verse 3, that why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the log that's in your own? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there is a log in your own eye, you hypocrite? First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I think a general principle that we can have, and again, this is not just with a spouse, this is not just in a relationship. I think that this kind of goes across the board, be it with our employees, our employers, our co-workers, our parents, our children, that the first thing that we can do when we approach a problem is find, what part did I play in it? And own it. What part did I play in this? And own it and apologize for it. Admit it without excuses, and I think that in doing so, you build a culture of self-accountability within a relationship. So the first question we ask ourselves, what is the goal of me bringing this up? Second question is, what part have I played in this? And then I think the third one is actually more for the recipient than the one giving the pruning. As the recipient, we have to ask ourselves that as I hear this, am I responding or am I going to react? Am I going to respond or am I going to react? See, I'm really good at doing this thing where when Laura brings something up, I just turn into a bluthering, withering mess. So that then she's like, oh man, he's so pathetic right now. I can't be mad at him, right? And I'm like, sweet, job accomplished. Avoided the conflict, right? You can't be mad at that guy blubbering on the ground. I'm so sorry, right? But yes, it's good to apologize, but are you apologizing so quickly to your spouse that they can't even voice the thing that they're trying to bring up? Are we creating a safe place for our loved ones to address issues in our lives? That's our responsibility as the recipient, is to respond, not to react. I think that when we react, we just lead the people we love to bottle things longer because they feel like if I was to bring anything up with you, it's just going to turn into this bigger issue. And so am I responding or am I reacting? It says this in James 1:19, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be three things: quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. I think if we can apply these three things to our lives, that we can have the kind of conflict in our relationship that's actually going to draw us together and forge a deeper foundation of love than push us apart. And pruning is difficult, because I think it's sometimes easier actually to prune the things in your spouse than it is to prune the things in yourself. But I think both sides of it are actually quite important. I heard someone say about marriage one time that the issue with marriage is that it brings you into conflict, not with the one that you love, but it brings you into conflict with yourself. The issue with marriage is that it brings you into conflict with yourself, that there's something about being in an intimate relationship with somebody that reveals things about you. You see sometimes almost a reflection from your spouse of these areas of your life that you've let grow out of control. These areas of our lives that we have unattended baggage. These areas of our lives where we've just let things spiral a little bit into an unhealthy place. And I think that there's this deep fear that goes along with this, that coincides with it. This fear that if those parts of my life were to be exposed, then I would not be loved. I think that one of the greatest fears among many of us is that I cannot be both fully loved and fully known. And so we take these areas of our hearts, we take these areas of our lives, and we hide them. We cover them. We don't expose them out of this fear that if we do, that we're going to receive rejection. But I don't think the alternative is that much better. That if we are fully loved, but we're not fully known, that's a superficial kind of love. So I want to leave you with this today, church. That I think that there's one place and one place alone that we find the foundation, that we find the building blocks of that kind of love. I think it's hard to show that kind of love until you've experienced that kind of love. And so if to be fully loved and yet not known is superficial, and to be fully known but not fully loved is our greatest fear, I believe that to be fully loved and fully known is simply the gospel. That it is a love that we can try and show. It's a love that we can try to replicate. It's love that we hope to build among our spouses, but ultimately, I think that it is a type of love that finds its perfection in one place and one place alone. And that is in the person of Jesus Christ. To be fully known, the deepest, darkest corners of your heart, and fully loved nonetheless. It's the gospel. That's the gospel. It says this in Ephesians 2. That God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, that even when, does it say even when we deserved it? Does it say even when we earned it? Does it say even when we were the perfect spouse that we ought to be? Even when we cleaned up all those messy corners of our hearts? No. That what is the gospel? That God in his rich mercy laid his life down. Why? Because of the love with which he loved us, that even when we were dead, there is one place and one place alone that dead things can come back alive. You may feel like that plant that has withered and died. That plant who, through lack of nutrition, lack of love, has become a frail version of itself. This is the gospel. The gospel is the story of not turning bad people good, but bringing dead people alive. That even when we were dead in our trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ. Not by works, lest anyone should boast. By grace, you've been saved.